London, August 1305. The morning air still carried the scent of damp straw, soot, and old blood. A city accustomed to violence stirred awake. On the cobbled streets, the clatter of hooves and the shouts of market vendors echoed as usual. But today, a different sound would take over the air, the roar of a bloodthirsty crowd gathering eager to witness one of the most brutal public spectacles in England's history. The man they came to see die was no thief, no common murderer. He was William Wallace, the Scottish knight, who dared to stand against the English crown, who had united his countrymen in the name of freedom. But the death awaiting him was not merely the end of a life. It was a production meticulously staged, meant not just to destroy the man, but the symbol he had become. Modern cinema has romanticized Wallace's final moments, a noble hero dying swiftly and with honor. But the truth is far darker, far more horrific. King Edward I Longshanks did not merely want Wallace dead. He wanted him broken. This was not revenge. It was a warning carved in flesh: in fire defy the crown, and you will be annihilated. Wallace was not granted the death of a warrior. He was sentenced to be hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered, a punishment reserved for traitors. A sentence meant to strip away not only life but dignity, faith, and humanity. They wanted to grind him into dust before thousands to scar Scotland's memory forever. To understand the cruelty of Wallace's death, one must return to the world that shaped it, a time where the line between justice and tyranny was often drawn in blood. Late 13th century Scotland was not the unified nation we imagine today. It was a fractured land torn between civil war, foreign control, and noble rivalries. After the death of King Alexander III and his heir, the young Margaret, Maid of Norway, a power vacuum plunged the country into chaos. 13 nobles vied for the crown, and into this chaos stepped Edward I of England, posing as an arbitrator, but with ambitions to make Scotland a vassal state. Out of this darkness emerged an unlikely figure. Not a noble, not a prince, just a man with nothing left to lose, his family torn apart under English occupation. That man was William Wallace. When Wallace gathered men and triumphed at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, he did the unthinkable. He crushed the English army, their elite knights, and heavy cavalry. It was more than a military victory. It was a message: Scotland would not kneel. But Edward I was not a king who tolerated defiance. He had already crushed Wales with fire and steel, expelled the Jews from England, and now he faced a different kind of threat, not just a rebel, but a living symbol. Wallace understood his fate. He knew he would not die an old man in bed. As he continued to fight, hunted, hidden, hated, he chose a path with no return. But he never turned back. Because a symbol cannot be tolerated. A symbol must be destroyed. And so the hunt began, not to kill a soldier, but to erase an idea. Years passed. Edward's network of spies and collaborators closed in. Bounties were posted. Rewards were promised. And finally, in August 1305, Wallace was captured near Glasgow, betrayed, some say, by Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had pledged loyalty to the English. The truth behind the betrayal may be debated, but its result is not William Wallace was in enemy hands. In London, crowds cheered, but for Edward, the capture was only the beginning. Wallace would not die in darkness. He would die in the daylight, his agony a warning to all. He was shackled, paraded from village to village like a prize beast. His journey to London was not a prisoner's transfer. It was psychological warfare. The English wanted him humiliated long before he reached the scaffold. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace was dragged into Westminster Hall. But this was no trial. It was a pageant of power. Wallace had no lawyer, no defense, no hope. The judges were appointed by Edward himself. The outcome was sealed. The proceedings were held in Latin, a language Wallace likely did not understand. He was charged with treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, rebellion. A list as long as it was absurd, for how could he betray a king he never acknowledged? When allowed to speak, Wallace stood tall and said, "I could not be a traitor, for I was never your subject." A lone voice in a hall filled with wolves, sharp, proud, and final. But defiance would not save him. Edward wanted not just an execution, but a performance. Wallace was sentenced to the most gruesome death the law could offer: hanged, drawn, quartered. This was not just punishment. It was destruction made ritual. Hanging but not to kill meant rejection by heaven. Disembowelment while alive was the burning of compassion. Beheading severed honor. Quartering shattered his legacy, scattering the symbol to the wind. On the morning of the execution, Smithfield was packed. Thousands flooded in, some with children. Vendors sold wine, pies, and souvenirs. Wallace was pulled from the Tower of London, strapped to a wooden frame and dragged through the city. Rocks and filth pelted him. Blood stained the streets. The people cheered. He was barely conscious when he arrived, but his eyes still open, still watching, never begged. The scaffold was raised high like a stage. The executioner appeared rope in hand. Wallace was hanged, his face turned purple, limbs jerking violently. But just before death, he was cut down. Then the knife came. Without a word, the executioner slashed open his abdomen. Blood poured. The crowd screamed. Organs were torn out and tossed into a blazing fire beside him. The smell of burning flesh spread through the air. According to medieval belief, the bowels housed emotion. Burning them while Wallace still lived symbolically erased his humanity. But Wallace's eyes remained open. Witnesses claimed he murmured something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps the name of Scotland. Finally, mercy arrived. A single swing of the axe ended it. His head fell. The body was quartered, limbs severed like meat in a butcher's shop. Each part was paraded and dispatched. Stirling, Perth, Berwick, Newcastle. The head was tarred and mounted on London Bridge, blood dripping into the Thames. But he was not forgotten. He was immortalized. Wallace's death did not silence Scotland. It ignited it. His pain became legend. His scream became anthem. His death became a beacon. Whispers of his story echoed in taverns, in old songs, in the lullabies of mothers cradling newborn Scots. His martyrdom lit a fire in the heart of Robert the Bruce, who rose rallied and won at Bannockburn, carving a path toward independence with Wallace's shadow behind every stride. Wallace had no crown, no royal blood, but his blood birthed a nation's will. Final message, a lesson for all time. William Wallace's death did not mark the end of his fight. It marked the beginning of his myth. In a modern world where power often masquerades as principle, we forget that sometimes the weakest change the course of history, not through force, but through refusal to bow. Wallace did not win, but he never surrendered. He did not survive, but he never submitted. Freedom is never free. It is earned through suffering, kept alive by courage, and passed down through memory. And perhaps this is what Wallace gave us, not only to the Scots, but to all who dream of a life unchained. Even as his body was torn apart, his spirit remains in every flag raised against oppression, in every voice that dares say no to tyranny. He died in silence, but his death still speaks. History remembers kings. It remembers conquerors. But sometimes it remembers a man who had none of that, no crown, no army, no inheritance, just an unbreakable will. William Wallace was torn limb from limb, his head boiled in tar, his flesh scattered like a warning. And yet, we still speak his name, because though his enemies destroyed his body, they could not touch the idea he died for. Because an idea, when watered with blood and carried by courage, cannot be buried. It grows stronger, louder, eternal. And so we remember not because he won a war, but because he never gave up on something greater than himself. In every generation, there comes a time when silence is no longer an option, when comfort must give way to conviction. Wallace reminds us, there are things worth suffering for, there are causes worth dying for, and there are moments in history when a single act of defiance can echo for centuries. So when you stand at a crossroad, when fear whispers that surrender is safer, remember this man. Remember what was done to him, and remember what he became. Because in the end, freedom does not belong to the mighty. It belongs to those who choose it again and again, even when it costs everything.